Bertie staggered towards Madame Clarence, his progress painfully slow, hindered as it was by the convulsions of a man in the grips of mortal fear. Madame Clarence's facial expression, like that of a Grecian statue, was timeless and serene. Her right arm was outstretched, and her index finger pointed fixedly at a large black bag of silk that lay on the table in front of her. Scarcely had Bertie paid his debt than a most remarkable occurrence took place. A young man, his face replete with a bushy, upturned moustache, stood up in the third row from the front. His shaking hand betrayed a fear that only great courage could have mastered. His eyes burned with moral indignation. His whole stance was accusatory. "Can't you see she's tricking you? She's after your money. She's exploiting your personal sorrows, your fears, just to get your money. She's nothing but a—" The sound that followed defies description. To refer to it as a shriek, a scream, or gurgle would be to do that sound or noise a great injustice. If ever pharynx may convey to mortal ears reverberations from the pit which is bottomless, if ever uvula trilled to rend to the human mind, though it were only for a moment, the anguish of Dives, then it was that noise on that night in Chipping Bumpstead. As though the coils of a constricting serpent had been about his throat, the young man staggered towards the exit, uttering as he did so a word that some present on that occasion took to be mercy. Once outside the door, the young man gave one final yell of pain or deep remorse. He then seemed to dissolve into the outer darkness. From her expression it seemed that Madame Clarence shared in the consternation of her audience, an audience petrified, as silent as the grave. Her eyes were moist and ruddy, like the eyes of a mother made disconsolate by a wayward son. The black lace about her face vibrated, as once more she became the centre of everyone's attention. "Foolish boy, poor boy, you should not have done that." As emotion had loosened her tentative grip of the English language, she used the good offices of her interpreter to say, "It is a dangerous and most fearful thing to trifle with the powers beyond, as the fate of the young stranger should have revealed even to the most hardened scoffer. Now that your heartstrings are vibrant with awe and compassion, repay your debts to those who have passed on. No, give in generous abundance, more than the Lord demands. Give in such measure that departed friends and relatives should enjoy independence and comfort, a few luxuries perhaps. Mere solvency is not enough." Stewards passed round collection bags, and even in that poorly lit hall many a multicolored glitter bore witness to the fact that this mysterious transaction between the earthly and the spiritual realms involved more than items of cheap junk. An impression later corroborated by the findings of a questionnaire circulated by the CID. Now, this revealed that a conservatively estimated sum of £50,000, jewellery being assessed on its resale value, must have been collected. The stewards ceremoniously brought the bags to the front of the hall and deposited them on the table where Madame Clarence was sitting. "I can assure you that your repayments and gifts will be greatly appreciated. You yourselves shall not go unrewarded, if you believe my words. In a moment, complete darkness shall supervene. Do not fear, but heed my words. Weight and consolation shall be yours." Sure enough, the hall was plunged into darkness. and for the next 15 minutes no one ventured to say or do anything. At last somebody said, "It's a con! Get the police!" Within 5 minutes the hall was empty. No one switched the lights on, and one can only speculate as to the reason. Shame at being thought a fool. Did I say empty? Almost empty. One person remained, Mrs. Marjorie Chapman. She believed, deep in her heart, that she had to wait. Perhaps it was the word consolation that had appealed so deeply to her innermost feelings. She waited half an hour, 2 hours, almost 3 hours. Was she immune to the gnawing doubt that she was the most inveterate dupe in a community of dupes? If she entertained such a thought, she most certainly succeeded in suppressing it, and would doubtless have sat there until daybreak, to the detriment of her none too perfect health, if deliverance had not come. All of a sudden she sensed that a door had been opened, that a loved one was in her presence, that heaven had not been deaf to the plea of her heart. "Cecil, Cecil, is that you?" "Cecil," came an answer out of the darkness. "Not living lightly. This is Fred Jackson, come to lock up. Here, ain't that spooky lark over yet?" Yes, indeed, it was none other than Frederick Jackson, a retired London publican whose part-time job it now was to lock up the community hall after hours. Time passed. Madame Clarence was apprehended on a charge of acquiring money and jewellery by false pretences. Her defence was hard put to make out a defence. The Crown had its problems too, as only a minute proportion of the missing money and jewellery was recovered. Madame Clarence's explanation was simple. How could anyone expect to find what had been transspiritualized into the realm beyond? The defence counsel argued, possibly with tongue-in-cheek, that if nothing else, Madame Clarence's alibi had the merit of being consistent within a certain frame of reference. Furthermore, Madame Clarence's assertion does not allow itself to be circumscribed by the limits of normal rationality. As defence counsel also pointed out, no one in the audience had been forced to give anything. It could not be proved that Madame Clarence intended to deceive her listeners, only that she enjoined them to make a somewhat surprising leap of faith, to act in accordance with a very bold metaphysical assertion. All this promised to mark a notch in legal history, but for a very sad and unexpected event, Madame Clarence's sudden death. On the very day of her funeral, the wedding bells were ringing from the steeple of Chipping Bumpstead Parish Church. "Another slice of wedding cake, Freddie, darling?" asked the bride. From that day on, Mrs. Marjorie Jackson, née Higgins, Mrs. Chapman by her first marriage. "Don't mind if I do," said Freddie. Despite all the small talk, Mrs. Jackson could hear some of the guests in the background talking about Madame Clarence. Such snatches as, "If you were so convinced that she was a con woman, why didn't you do something to stop it before it was too late? I suppose I was hypnotized somehow like everybody else." And from another quarter, "What surprises me is that so many of my parishioners went along to that thing. They must have heard me preach on the Witch of Endor on some occasion or other. Anyway, she got her comeuppance in the end. You're right there, poor woman. If you've been taken in, you've none to blame but yourself, is what I always say." But now all that Mrs. Jackson could hear was an undifferentiated buzz. Having surrendered to a sudden impulse, she clasped her bridegroom by the hand and was looking into his eyes with a serene and yet intense smile. She remembered what Madame Clarence had said. Wait and consolation shall be yours. Those were her words, and she knew those words were true.